We got 15 minutes, so I was going to say 5 things, 3 minutes each. So here we go. Number 1. So as you picked up in the piece, I think, one of the things that I've been interested in is this idea of ghettos as both absence and presence. And of course the two are interrelated, because putting one ethnic or racial group in one place means removing them from another. So there's a strong sense, isn't there, in which both ghettoization always involves creating absences and presences. I think one of the things that I've been interested in my work is the way in which there's been shifting priorities given to those two different things. So whether ghettoization has been about primarily a kind of cleansing of the remainder of a city, or whether it's been more a kind of gathering. So a focus, if you like, on the ghettoized group, in my case Jews, or primarily a focus on the non-ghettoized group, in my case non-Jewish neighbours. And all of that involves drawing boundaries, and as when you talked about it, I think that's one of the things that comes across in both papers is this sense of the porosity of boundaries, that these boundaries are kind of much more messy. But for the individuals that are involved in creating ghettos, especially in the context that I'm looking at, drawing up those boundaries is a kind of critical task of control within places like Warsaw and Budapest. And what I hope I show is that this is far from a straightforward process, and that in both of these two major capital cities during the war, ghettoization takes months and years to work out. There's a whole series of plans that are proposed and discarded, and then the ghetto is constantly changing shape. In part, I think, because of this issue about absence and presence. And what really interests me, I think, is that in both places, initial ideas seem to focus much more around absence. So in Warsaw, one of the things that's striking, I think, is that the ghetto initially, as in its very early stages, where something like a ghetto is being created, is about an absence of German troops. So it's about a place where German soldiers do not go. And in the case of Budapest, there's in these made plans, 9th of May 1944, there's this explicit attempt to clear out parts of the city, the most prestigious parts of the cities of Jews. And the language that's used is one of cleansing within the documents, which is about cleaning out the city of its Jewish presence and imagining a new kind of Budapest where Jews are removed from certain places. So those ideas of absence and presence, I think, have been kind of central to some of my earlier work, and really I've been interested in many ways at thinking about the way in which those ideas have kind of shifted and the priorities given to them by ghetto planners, those people I call doctors of space after Henri Lefebvre, have changed. But as I hope you see in the paper, the other thing I'm really interested in is moving ideas away from primarily thinking of ghetto planners and Jews to think much more around non-Jewish neighbours and the role of non-Jewish neighbours in these places. Ghettoization in both Warsaw and Budapest and elsewhere involved non-Jews, and non-Jewish neighbours, Hungarians and Poles, had strong views about where a ghetto was going to be or not. And there's considerable contestation in both cities at the ghetto boundary. In Budapest, I think that leads to some really interesting situations in terms of the scale at which ghettoization takes place. And what I argue, I think, is that in both cities you get a sense that because of the impact of non-Jewish actors, ordinary Hungarians, ordinary Poles, what I think you get is a kind of pragmatic sense of the ghetto being implemented in both cities, which is, I talk about it as a ghetto being taken to the Jews rather than the Jews being taken to a ghetto. So a kind of hardening, a recognising of Jewish demographic patterns. Not primarily, I don't think, for ideological reasons, but I think much more for pragmatic reasons as a response to the way in which ghettoization is being negotiated within urban space between planners, Jews and non-Jews. And it's interesting, I know a couple of the papers that you've had talk about the work of Dan Mitchman, who's written a book on ghettos. And it's interesting because Mitchman talks about ghettos, especially in the Polish context, being placed into the places primarily of Jewish demographic presence, so the places where Jews live in the city. And he sees ghettoization in many ways as a kind of, that there's a sense of a kind of Eastern Jew and Ostjuden in Polish cities, and the ghettos are built around that. So he foregrounds ideology as the basis for the reasons why ghettos are a place where Jews already live. I think what I want to suggest is that there may be other things that we need to take into account, and I'd suggest it's not just ideology, but I think also social economic factors, and a range of kind of pragmatic decisions also need to be factored in. And also to think about ghettoization as in some ways taking place even during something like Nazi occupation within the kind of norms of urban planning and the kinds of rules and approaches and the kind of paperwork in many ways of urban planning. I mean, I guess I should hold, most of my work is work that in many ways is about kind of social economics. So, I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I, in some ways, that I guess my position is not one primarily where I focus on ideological factors and explaining what happens during the Holocaust. A lot of my work is much more about more banal reasons for the ghettoization and deportation of Hungarian Jews. Third thing, and this is where I think Stephen's paper, maybe I can focus in on two things which really I see kind of, well, the last three things I think are where you get this strong sense of the overlaps between the two papers. Third thing I think is this issue of porosity and fluidity. And I think that comes through in my own work, and I think I was really struck by that reading Stephen's work as well, this sense of the idea of Harlem as variegated, as this kind of variegated space, and this crisscrossing of people in and out of Harlem. And that's certainly something that you find within the context of Budapest. I think it's a really unusual ghetto that's created in Budapest. It's created at the scale of the individual house, and ultimately, as I show, it's created at the scale of the individual apartment within those houses. And what's interesting, I think, about this mapping that we've done here is that this mapping, in a sense, doesn't show the reality at all. It's a mapping that's done at the scale of the apartment building. What we haven't done is managed to map down to that scale of the individual apartments, where you would get a much more fluid and variegated kind of picture that emerges, the sort of picture that Stephen paints, and that's something that I'd like to try and do a little bit more with. The sources are a problem there, but I think we could do it in some buildings. That sense of fluidity and porosity, I think, is something that I was struck came through in a number of the papers. Annika's paper on labour, she talks quite a bit about the way in which exiting the ghetto for labour was both about performing useless labour, but was also an opportunity to access, for example, weapons that could be then smuggled into the ghetto for resistance, or give access to the partisans, which is something that Svi and Lenore write about in their paper. And I think it's also there on the edges of Helene's paper as well, where she talks about hunger and about smuggling, certainly in the context of Warsaw. The ghetto wall is enormously porous as smuggling is bringing in large amounts of the food that's consumed within the city. And that, I think, interests me, that sense of, and maybe this gets to the kind of bigger theme of the Sawyer seminar, doesn't it, to try and think about the sort of liminality of the spaces in between, of the movement in and out, of the sense that ghettos aren't these hardened contexts, even in the context of the Second World War, that I think that there's considerable porosity. I recognise that Budapest is an unusual case, but I think across, the more that we learn about ghettos, especially ghettos maybe in places like Belarus or Ukraine, the more we realise that there's actually places where there's open ghettos, or there's considerable porosity, or there's regular exchange and opportunities for exchange. In short, there's this much more variegated story, I think, that you find within the context of the Second World War ghettos, as well as in the context of Harlem, as Stephen points out. Linked to that, and this was one of the things that really intrigued me about Stephen's paper, was this concern with mapping movement and the kind of rhythm of night and day, of summer and winter, of weekday and Sunday. So moving away from a kind of static mapping, and you talk primarily about the census as a way that kind of, in a sense, maps residency in a certain way and doesn't allow for the difference between night and day. But you say actually in summer people may not be sleeping at these places which the census regulators see them at. And I think that's one of the criticisms I'd have of this map, which is that I think this is in many ways a map that's at the wrong scale, because it's the apartment building, not the apartment. And it's also a map that's very static, because it suggests, in some ways, and I think there's some truth to this, but it suggests that there's a lack of movement of Jews within the city. These are just a couple of other maps that I pulled out which aren't in the paper, where what we did as well was we tried to map the walking to the market hall. So we know that market hall is one of the kind of critical places that Jews are going to within this curfew period. And what I think is striking about it is how you see, again, I think it's a variegated pattern in many ways, like Stephen's, isn't it? Where Jews during that period may have been, and obviously this is a kind of modelling rather than anything that's drawn primarily from the source material. It knows where people left, it knows where people went to, it doesn't know how they got in between the two apart from a low-cost route to the closest distance. But it's suggestive, I think, of a way of thinking about this city as a place where actually Jews are moving through the city and through vast parts of the city, and there's opportunities for exchange between Jews and non-Jews, not just within their apartment buildings, but also across the city as a whole. And I think that idea of mapping movement is something, this is just where we did it with the densities of the houses, so we took the kind of house sizes from the census, where you can see, I think, suggesting that you've got some streets in the city where there may well have been very large numbers of Jews moving around in the afternoon hours to access shopping compared to the picture over on the Buddha side of the river. And I think that is one thing that I think is really suggestive in Stephen's paper, and I think would be worth trying to do more with. I think it's one of the challenges in many ways, is how do you map? In some ways it's the kind of challenge of time and space, isn't it? Is that you're thinking about temporal rhythms or temporality in terms of mapping. One of the things we've done is we've created an animation of this, which is one way you can try and do that, so a kind of animated mapping. But I think there's more sophisticated ways that we could develop to try and think about mapping movement through urban space. Final thing, and I think this again comes through hopefully in the paper and very much also comes through in Stephen's paper. Stephen writes in the paper, maps point to possible patterns and raise questions rather than offering answers. Mapping this approach is a prompt to think spatially. And I think that's been very much the spirit of the kind of new project that I've been involved with Alberto Giordano. And I guess that's thinking about mapping and visualization in a new way, not as a kind of final product, but much more as a research process, as a kind of an interim stage of a way of working with the sources, a way of visualizing the sources to ask new questions. And this is probably the sort of simplest way to show this, is just two maps that kind of grabbed my attention. And this probably means absolutely nothing to anyone. To me, this was like a eureka moment when we created this map. So there's a moment in 16th of June 1944 where there's about 2,500 ghetto houses are issued on the list. A week later, it's reduced to 1,900. And I'd made a lot of that in my earlier work, especially I think from a close reading of all of these petitions that are submitted to the local authorities. And then what we do is we run a mapping once we go for an approach which adds density to the housing locations. And suddenly what's extraordinary is you can see that the ghetto is shrinking in size from 2,500 to 1,900. The green circle is and the green is the 16th of June, the purple is the 22nd. But what I couldn't believe was the centre of gravity of ghettoisation, the two dots in the middle, hardly shifted at all. It's more clear, I think, when you do something called kernel density analysis. So mean centre is about finding one single point of all of the data that you have. Kernel density is much more around finding peaks and troughs, so it's a little bit more kind of sophisticated. It's not just finding a single mean, but it's trying to find a more kind of sophisticated sense of where the hotspots are, if you like. And what I was really struck by was how the hotspots of ghettoisation hardly shifted between those 2 weeks. And nor did they shift, really, between those 2 weeks and two of the crucial ghettos in the 9th of May plans, and then the final ghettos that are created in the winter of 1944. And this was a moment where suddenly I was forced to ask questions about continuity rather than change. And I think it was one of those moments where, as a historian in the archives, 600 petitions, you read them all as a graduate student, and you think, hey, there must be something going on. And I think there is something going on. But in many ways, I think I'd almost been seduced by the archive a little bit to assume that a lot of paperwork means that there's something significant happening. And here was a way of seeing that in a different kind of light and thinking much more about a story of continuity rather than a story of change. Final just example of that, I think, is these walking distance maps that we created. I talk a bit about those, where I realise we're kind of really on speculative territory here, and I'm kind of interested in this as a historian. Is at what point as historians can we work in almost a kind of way of modelling? So where we don't have the archival material, can we use maps in a more kind of speculative modelling way? not as a kind of final product that says this is a sort of historical reality, but much more as a kind of prompt to thinking. And I think for me that's one of the big kind of challenges that being involved in this digital humanities project and working with GIS mapping has been, is to think less about maps as a kind of thing that I put in the book as a sort of final product of, this is the sort of nice illustration that goes with the research I've done, but much more as a kind of early stage intervention that then forces me back to the archive in new ways. And these maps really did do this for me, that suddenly just trying to think about distance within the city, within this dispersed ghetto, made me go back to the archive and ask a whole new lot of questions. I think what was interesting, and I hope it comes across a little bit in the paper, is that in many ways these maps suggested a kind of idea of what I talk about as invisible walls within this city, to the market halls or the hospitals or to the Swiss legation buildings. What I think was interesting is when I went down to the level of going back to the archive, in many ways what I realised was that the ways that people were able to subvert those invisible walls. And I think that's where I don't want to throw a kind of close reading of text out within the context of digital humanities. But I think there's a value to this kind of distant reading of visualising the archive as a way of prompting new questions. But in some ways, I think I still, at the end of the project, am very much drawn down to the level of detail within oral history, testimony, within memoir accounts, within the paperwork of the municipal authorities. And it's kind of there in many ways where I think some of these more speculative maps that we've created, or these models that we've created, have been tested and maybe found wanting. But in a sense, I don't think I would have gone there to test without that interim process of doing the mapping. So I think there's a kind of value to this sense of thinking about visualising the archive as kind of part of a research process. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, Wendy, Joe, for putting Tim and I together, which I think is a fantastic pairing. Like anybody, I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to share a session, I don't have my own session. But actually, there is an enormous synergy, as Tim's just laid out, between what we were doing. And in fact, we have a colleague in common in Paul Jascott, who's the Mellon Professor at the National Gallery at the moment, who actually generously gave me a copy of the book that Tim's work is in. And Tim actually isn't in the notes of the very much work in progress paper that I gave you, but the maps that he just showed you about movement were really important to me as I tried to make a major shift in what's been a decade-long project on Harlem, to try and get away from much more static ways of understanding the neighbourhood to much more dynamic ways, where something as simple as thinking not so much about space but about movement is utterly transformative in the way that you think about neighbourhoods. And it's one of the reasons why, in fact, the word ghetto is not in my paper at all, because I think that I've come to feel that that is a far too static concept for places that are fundamentally parts of larger cities and environments, and in which nobody is locked up and kept within bounds to an exclusive enough extent for that, particularly for African American neighbourhoods, to be a meaningful way of thinking about them. And here this is maybe, I'm foreshadowing what I see as really maybe the more dramatic kind of distinction between the other ghettos you've been talking about in African American neighbourhoods, that simply were never places apart from the city in a way that the other kinds of European ghetto models that have been applied to them were. And I think we really do a disservice to what it was like to live in the neighbourhood, to use ghetto as a way of describing the city. So we can talk a little bit more about that going forward. And certainly Gilbert Osofsky's book on Harlem, which is subtitled The Making of a Ghetto, I think really has set a lot of the historiography off on the wrong track. And I think there's a chronological argument there as well. If you could ever talk about Harlem as a ghetto, it would not be in the 1920s, which I look at. It would be in the 1930s, and it would be as a result of the Depression, rather than, I think, as a result of the other kinds of factors that the ghetto directs us towards. So I'm just going to go quickly through this. Again, I'm really appreciative of talking to an audience where you've read the paper and I don't have to deliver it to it, and you have to try and stay awake and concentrate on it. I just want to give a little bit of a context for this project, because this is a part of and the outgrowth of a lot more work, which is why there's an enormous collection of logos at the bottom of this slide. This was a project that I actually started at the University of Sydney. It's a collaborative project. 4 of us originally. Unfortunately, Graham White, who's standing next to me here, died several years ago. it's largely the work of myself and Shane White, who's standing there in the blue shirt, who some of you I'm sure are familiar with, who's been working on African Americans in New York City in the 18th and the 19th century for his whole career, and recruited me to be part of this project because the core records that he wanted to look at to find ordinary African Americans in New York City were legal records, the same legal records that I've been using for my first book. And that's Stephen Garton, Graham White, who's not related to Shane White, and then Stephen Garton, who at the moment is basically effectively the president of the University of Sydney, and not exactly an active researcher on this project. We also had a technical team working with us. Damien Evans up the top built this, the database at the original site, and then went to Angkor Wat in Cambodia and has never returned. I'm not going to bore you with the enormous challenges that produced for the rest of the project. Ian Johnson, Andrew Wilson, and Andrew Lead in the bottom here did the rest of that. 2 logos, they renamed themselves, they no longer exist at the University of Sydney, which is another series of technical issues that I won't bore you with, but as friendly as they look here, they had a major falling out, and that unit is now dissolved. Archaeologists, though, they were the mapping people at the University of Sydney. They wanted to create a GIS project. Damien begrudgingly built me a Google map-based mock-up as an interim measure, which did everything I wanted it to do, and then I fought with them for the next 2 years not to build a GIS. I'll talk a little bit more about that if anybody's interested in, but Digital Harlem is really a geospatial web project, not a GIS project, and as I think is true of almost all of the digital humanities mapping projects that have been created, which I think reach for the kinds of questions that historians are more interested in. Digital Harlem, the web site, was part of a much larger project on everyday life in Harlem in the 1920s. It was a sort of an add-on that I wanted to do. I'd say that partly just so that people don't think that this was a web-first project. This was a much larger project. We produced a whole series of publications out of that. A book on numbers gambling, which we wrote rather than a book on everyday life in Harlem, because numbers were so pervasive across every facet of life in the neighbourhood and so poorly understood in the historiography. So that's the book we ended up writing, as well as a series of articles, some of them impacted by mapping and some of them not. We really built Digital Harlem for ourselves. It's not a public history project, it's a public project. The audience, therefore, that really is able to use it is us, because we understand what it can do. We've made some efforts to make it available to other kinds of people. We're also only able to build it towards the end of this project because of the slightly strange way that the funding that we got was constructed. The original grant for Digital Harlem was a 5-year grant from the Australian Research Council. They didn't really give out 5-year grants. 3 years was as long as they usually did. They were interested in funding big collaborative projects. They didn't get a lot of big collaborative humanities projects. They got lots of groups of people writing 4 vaguely related books saying that they were collaborating, which they didn't fund. This was a genuinely collaborative project. They funded it. The 4th and 5th years were outside their funding cycle, so that was where most of the money was. The first 3 years were inside the funding cycle where it wasn't. We didn't have the resources to build Digital Harlem to the end. That's a somewhat long way of saying that spatial transformation, the prompt to think spatially that Tim was, I think, correctly directing your attention to, didn't come till much later. So it's not a big part of the numbers book. It's not a big part of some of the books of the piece on Hubert Julian, the aviator and celebrity in Harlem. It's not a big part of the piece we wrote on con men and confidence games in Harlem. Not really even a big part of the piece that I wrote on undercover investigators and nightlife. It begins to be a bigger part of the piece we wrote on, called This Harlem Life, which is on, that follows 5 men who were put on probation in the 1920s and 1930s for big chunks of their lives. But it's a much bigger part of the last 2 pieces I wrote, one on the disorderly houses piece, which is actually on privacy, and an argument against the notion that there was no possibility of privacy in overcrowded homes in Harlem, which just, the argument of that in short is nonsense. There's tons of privacy available, and that it really is a question I wouldn't have asked without the spatial pieces. And then the last piece is the piece on the white presence in Harlem, which I think is in some ways, again, fundamentally about a much more fluid notion of space, and about recognising that while there are essentially no whites living in the core of Harlem where African Americans live, there are in fact thousands of whites there most of the day. Not just the slummers that people have been preoccupied with, but the people who own and operate practically all of the businesses in Harlem. So for me, my opening hook image of Harlem that I fall back on is one that was not part of the way we started thinking about the neighbourhood, but was what the scene must have been at the bus stops and subway stops in Harlem at the beginning of each day. Thousands of African Americans getting on public transport to leave the neighbourhood for work, passing thousands of whites coming into the neighbourhood to run all of the businesses. And those whites were there all day and into the night, and then left and slept somewhere else and are not in the census. And all the blacks are in the census, and they're in Harlem for a few hours each weekday and a bit of the Sunday, but they're in the census and they make it look like a black neighbourhood. And so, that's, in some ways that's the nub from which the paper that I gave you to read came. So having thought about Harlem for over a decade in much more static ways, I've eventually arrived at this point where that simply doesn't capture what the neighbourhood was like, as far as I'm concerned. And so I've started to try and reimagine a picture of the neighbourhood grounded in everyday life, grounded in the experience of ordinary people, and therefore grounded in movement and mobility, because people are simply not sitting still in the neighbourhood. I'm trying to remember, Tim, this is Digital Harlem. I gave you some static maps. I hate producing static maps. The whole power of Digital Harlem is that it's a dynamic, interactive map. One of the challenges of the moment we are in scholarship in the humanities is our publication means continue to insist that we don't use things like this. The reality is that we do, and melding those two things is impossible. That's one of the reasons why I started work on the blog that goes alongside this, was to attempt to capture even a static colour map, which is not going to appear in any publication I produce, let alone any maps at all. I gave you some partly because you have to interact with this site to produce maps, and sometimes that's not straightforward to do. As I said, it's not really built fundamentally for other people to do that. I'm trying to remember what most of the slides are. The map that we used matters a lot too. The layer that we put on top of Google Maps are real estate maps of Harlem. I think it's a point about the realities of mapping. Our default map is a street map, which when you stop to think about it is probably the least informative map of a neighbourhood you could possibly have. Streets and nothing else. But that's not what you're actually standing looking at in the middle of a neighbourhood. These real estate maps, which I can look at, I have to say, for hours and hours, populate those streets with buildings and give you some basic sense of what those buildings were, how many floors they were, whether they had basements, whether they had stores. You've got footprints, and suddenly you've actually got something that looks like the neighbourhood, not streets, which are streets, they're not the neighbourhood. So that's another prompt to think about the neighbourhood in fundamentally different ways. And I can never look at the few maps that we do get into our books in the same way again. You could never really put one of these maps in a book because they're just too big. So it's not as if I found a better map for my book. It's another argument for why the limits of the way we publish things. Digital Harlem is set up to let you search for events and places and people. You can't really search for people because in the end, entering that data proved prohibitively time-consuming. It works really well for events and places. If you assign it to students, they'll look at the events and they'll say, this is an everyday life, it's crime. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but there are certainly a lot of criminal categories that you can search for because that's the nature of the records we use. That is not the majority of the material in Digital Harlem, which is often the answer I give to the students about the critique. I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more, but we used legal records and newspapers. And I think, again, I came away from this project immensely frustrated with the way that newspapers have been used in most of the historiography on African American neighbourhoods. The African American newspapers are extraordinarily rich sources for life in a neighbourhood, and you would never know that from the way that they've been used in most of the historiography. Both Shane and I knew Larry Levine very well. We're very much part of his more positive read of African American culture and life. His review of David Levering Lewis's book, When Harlem Was in Vogue, and American Historical Review, I think is exactly our starting point for this book. That book, which has been enormously influential, leaves out most of the life in Harlem that you can find in black newspapers. Our whole project here has been to return that to the neighbourhood. This is, our work has always been a study of Harlem, not the Harlem Renaissance, which unfortunately has stood in for the neighbourhood in most of the work. And we're interested in the tens and hundreds of thousands of people who are not part of the Harlem Renaissance, not part of David Levering Lewis's book. I'm not going to really talk about that. That's just to show that one of the things that makes this map dynamic is that you can layer it. And that's one of the ways that separates the kinds of maps that you can produce interactively from static ones. So you can layer as many different searches of our database as you want. There's a very early one we did that's too, in some ways, related to what people have already said about Harlem. It maps the nightclubs that people are familiar with the speakeasies that they kind of know are there, and a venue called Buffet Flats that African Americans ran in their own homes that most people, including most whites, didn't know about, which is a central part of the dynamic of nightlife in Harlem, which becomes increasingly separate. So the whites are in the nightclubs, they're a little bit in the speakeasies, and the African Americans have the buffet flats to their own. This is more just to show the kinds of prompts to thinking that this produces. And Tim has stolen most of my best lines on that. I tend to talk about that as exploratory. Digital Harlem is not an end product, it's a way of exploring the neighbourhood and asking questions. This one is a classic example of the relationships that this threw up, and what this immediately, even on a perfunctory look, begins to show you is that the buffet flats are not in the same places as the nightclubs and the speakeasies, and that's because they're in people's homes, not in commercial streets, and therefore not on commercial, not connected to the core avenues running through Harlem, which is where all the businesses are. That forced us to ask some questions about why they're there and what that meant for who could go there and what that meant for how they operated, that we wouldn't have asked in the same way if we hadn't actually looked at this and said, hey, they're not in the same kind of place. I put these up, and I'll do this statically, to remind you that one of the powerful things about Digital Harlem is not that it just produces maps, but it allows you to bore down to the sources of every individual point on that map. So the first level is just a basic account. Because this is a map of places, it's a basic account of what the addresses are. The more detail button takes you into a much fuller pull from our database, and you can move around within that. So you can look at a place, you can look at all the things that we have in the database that happened there. If you look at an event, you can look at all the things that happened in the place, and you can move through the database. So this is, if you like, the super footnote version. It's another challenge to the way that we deal with scholarship now. There is no excuse for our perfunctory and highly restricted footnotes in the digital environment we work at. You can't put all of this in a footnote. You can certainly put all of it in a digital project that allows people to engage with your evidence in a better way. I'm almost done. In some ways, what I might think is most interesting, I put right at the front of this paper in a kind of almost manifesto style. The question that I ended up using as the title for this paper is my attempt to get away from the way that we've understood neighbourhoods before, which is far too much about institutions and organisations and static places, to really ask a different question about what it was like to live in Harlem is intended to actually put people in those places and to follow them around. And it requires mapping a web of locations in which people live their lives, rather than isolating particular institutions or particular addresses where they lived. And it involves tracing multiple rhythms, the repetitive as well as the linear, the weekly, the seasonally, and the way that they varied, and to pull that out rather than looking for a homogenised picture of what Harlem was like in the 1920s. And again, I'd like to emphasise that this isn't what we came to this project with. This is what I've come to out of a decade of grappling with the prompts that mapping provides to think about the neighbourhood in different ways, trying to answer the questions that the maps put in front of us that they absolutely cannot answer on their own, but which we went back to close reading of our sources to do. And in fact, doing this paper reminded me that one of the huge transformations across the period we worked on this project was the digitisation of newspapers. So we bought microfilm copies of the 1920s New York Age and New York Amsterdam News, the two book-back papers, so that we could work on them in Sydney. When we'd done most of that work, ProQuest digitised the Amsterdam News, which actually was no use to us at all, because ProQuest newspapers are so expensive that the University of Sydney, which is essentially an Ivy League university in Australia, could not afford the Amsterdam News, neither can George Mason University. In the close of this room, I will say that I hack into the Amsterdam News through my brother's Northeastern University account, because Northeastern has that. So it's both available but not available. The New York Age is slightly more available because it was digitised by newspapers.com, which is Ancestry.com's newspaper digitisation wing. What makes that more available is Ancestry is an individual subscriber model. So for, I think it's about $50 a year, I get the New York Age. ProQuest used to sell you individual subscriptions until they decided that business model didn't work for them. So when they first launched I actually had an individual subscription to the New York Times through the Baseball History Society, which gave it to you as a membership. I mentioned that partly because Roy Rosenzweig put me onto that. They've shut that down, so there's some ambivalence about that. But what that meant was that when I put a whole lot of new questions down to answer in this paper, I was able to go back and use the very crude search interfaces of digital newspapers to answer that. I don't think search is actually a very effective research way of accessing sources, but it is a very effective research method if you actually know what you're looking for in a way that mapping can help you do. So suddenly when I wanted to know where the children were, and I wanted to know about day nurseries, I could Google them, I could search the newspapers for day nurseries and actually find the scattering of information that is in there. I'd never have searched for day nurseries without the maps, without the questions that they prompted us to ask. So I think, yes, the last image that I'm going to show is simply this one, which I plucked out of my collection of images of Harlem to suggest in some ways what this paper is trying to do and how I think we need to think about these neighbourhoods. We've got to follow the people. We've got to walk the streets of Harlem with them. We've got to trace their daily lives. Tim's done a fantastic job of laying out, I think, what's at stake for that. Movement is the story for me now. Not space, not place, but movement. And movement in African American neighbourhoods does not follow boundaries, is not restricted by where we think of Harlem. One of the things that Digital Harlem has is 3 different boundaries for the black population in Harlem. That is Harlem, as it's been understood in the historiography. This entire paper that I gave you to read is about basically crossing that boundary so often that it disappears, that it blurs away, and recognising that that's the reality of the place that Harlem was. It was a place that people lived in, and they lived in it by moving around it. And they did that through multiple rhythms, and they did that in ways that meant that living in Harlem was not about living in a black neighbourhood. It was about coming into daily contact with whites, in and out that neighbourhood. The classic way of imagining that until now has been Jim Grossman's sort of homework, black-white analogy, where African Americans left their homes to work and encountered whites in their work days and then came back to a black place at night. In some ways that was the trigger for the piece on Harlem in black and white, which was to say, actually no, that doesn't work like that. The whites are in Harlem and everyday life required blacks to interact with them. You could not buy your groceries, you could not ride a bus, you could not ride a train, you could not go to school, you could not go to hospital, you could not do the things that are woven into daily life in a black neighbourhood without dealing with whites. And so there is a story of interracial relations within, not simply outside the neighbourhood, that we haven't told effectively. That does not mean there were not black spaces, but in the terms that Tim has already set up, it forces you to ask different questions about how those black spaces worked and where they fitted into people's lives around the various interracial encounters that they had. So in some ways that's my oblique return to the ghetto. And then there's an implicit argument, as I said at the beginning of this paper, that the ghetto is the least useful concept that we could use to apply to northern black neighbourhoods in this period. Harlem is perhaps at the extreme of that argument because of the relative lack of contest about the expansion of its boundaries compared to a place like Chicago. That's something we might want to talk about comparatively. It's also, just to return to Tim's model, and I hadn't really thought about this, it's a classic example of absence presence. As some of you, I didn't really talk about this in the papers, but as some of you might know, Harlem is not the original black neighbourhood in New York City. There are no blacks in Harlem in the period that my collaborator Shane White worked on in the 18th and 19th centuries. Blacks moved to Harlem in 1904. They start at, and again, this goes to your nice Kernel graph. They start at 134th Street and Lenox Avenue, and they expand out.
I think we're going to stop.
Right.